Have you ever been to a marketplace in Egypt? It's quite bizarre. Get it? The joke is basically that I can't believe Cyno is finally here. It's been 2 years since we were teased with his release. Actually, it might even be more than that. I'm still in denial, not like the Nile River. His gameplay is so freaking cool, and I honestly can't wait to share with you guys how to best build Cyno, some of his combos, teams, and everything you could ever need to know. As usual, before we get started, if you enjoy these kinds of videos, make sure to leave a like on the video. It really helps me out, and consider subscribing if you learned something new. With all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Cyno. Cyno's skills look so much more complicated than they actually are, so I'm going to break down everything into simple terms so that you can understand advanced Cyno concepts while also not being too confused. First off, let's talk about Cyno's Burst. Cyno's Burst converts normal and charged attacks into a completely different version of a normal and charged attack. It gives him claws. Now, in this state, his charged attacks take a long time to wind up, and I don't really recommend using them at all, but his normal attacks are pretty strong. When you activate his Burst, he gains 100 elemental mastery and a little bit of interruption resistance. Now, this actually isn't that much. You can still get staggered fairly easily, and for those of you looking to do a perfect combo, it can get very annoying if you don't have a shield. His burst starts at 10 seconds of duration, but his skill will extend it by 4 seconds every time you use it, up to a max of about 18 seconds. Now, one thing about Cyno is that because his burst lasts so long, buffs will usually run out for him before it's over. So depending on the team, you may or may not even need to use that full 18 seconds. However, because his elemental skill that you'll be using during his burst generates more energy, most of the time it's safe to say that he will want the full field time. His burst does cost 80 energy, but you'll fill that bank up pretty quick. Now, I know I mentioned his skill, let's talk about that really quickly. In its simplest form, it just deals electro damage and generates some particles. When you're outside of his burst, it's going to generate 3 particles and have a 7.5 second cooldown time. However, when you're in his burst, it starts to deal more damage, have a shorter cooldown, and generate less particles. For instance, it has a 3-second cooldown and it generates 1 to 2 particles while in his burst. Now, his first Ascension passive is going to give him some bonus damage while he's in his burst. Basically, every 4 seconds, you'll see this sort of eye image pop up on your screen, and that indicates that Cyno has entered the Endseer stance. All this means is that the next skill that you use with that on screen will have a 35% damage bonus and also deal 3 more hits of bonus damage based on Cyno's attack. The thing to be careful of is that the time to use your skill with this up is very small, meaning that if you want to deal significantly more damage with Cyno, you need to understand the eye timing. Now, the passive is actually a huge gain for him damage-wise if you play him with a certain artifact set that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, for his second Ascension passive, you're basically increasing his damage again, but this time it's based off his elemental mastery. His normals and his burst and the bonus hits from his previous Ascension passive all have their damage increased by his elemental mastery, which benefits him a lot, especially in Dendro teams. Essentially, it lets you double dip the stat. You get value from your reactions, you're also getting more value to his personal damage. Despite him not having a Millennium item, his kit does read like a Yu-Gi-Oh card. It's just important to know that it looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. It's just talking about a whole bunch of damage buffs. All of this is to say that Cyno is a pretty dang fun unit, and I really enjoy his gameplay personally. I think you will as well. The one issue with Cyno that I think everyone should be aware of is the fact that he can easily get interrupted during his burst. When you activate his burst, it does increase resistance to interruption. However, that is not often enough to keep him from getting staggered mid-combo, and you'll find that if you play him without a shield, that can get kind of annoying. For your talent priority, you want to prioritize both his burst and skill, and you can basically ignore his normal attacks. His burst has its own scaling separate from his normals, so the only time you'd use them is in a very specific infusion team. Otherwise, his normal attacks basically see no use. So I hope that this was easy enough for you guys to understand his kit. It's really not too complicated, but if you need to have another listen, go ahead and skip back to the timestamp in front. For now, let's move on to Artifacts Part 1, where I can tell you guys about a very specific combo and a very specific set. You might remember that Cyno has a very short cooldown on his elemental skill while he's in his burst. There's actually an artifact set that can make that even lower, which is the Thundering Fury set. It gives you some damage bonuses on your reactions and your electro damage, but in this case, the most important thing is the cooldown reduction. Up to once every 0.8 seconds, you can lower your elemental skill cooldown by 1 second by triggering an electro-based reaction with the wielder. Essentially, this just means in your damage window, you're able to get more skills while still lining up every window Shadow of Enseer stance for his Ascension 4 damage bonus. Now, technically, the optimal combo is to do the following: EQ, N2E, N3E, N4E, and spam. Essentially, what that means is you're going to use your skill, your burst, normal attack, 0 to 2 times, but 2 is optimal. Use his elemental skill, use 3 attacks, elemental skill, use 4 attacks and elemental skill, and just sort of spam that. And it should, hypothetically, if you execute it absolutely perfectly and nothing goes wrong, you should be able to get all 4 Enseer procs. Now, just a reminder, Enseer is basically when the eye is on your screen and you get bonus damage when you use your skill. However, this is almost impossible to do consistently against different types of enemies. If an enemy moves out of the way and your attack gets delayed, or your reaction that lowers your cooldown gets delayed, or if you just misplace an elemental skill just ever so slightly, the combo will fail, you will get offset, and you will be missing out on a ton of damage bonus. So what I've found to personally be helpful is if you're trying your best to follow this combo and it's a little inconsistent, it's actually more damage to just wait for the Enseer stance. So if you are just slightly misaligned with your Enseer windows, what you can do is just wait for the third one. That's what I ended up doing, and it ended up lining up perfectly fine. Did I lose a little bit of damage compared to the optimal combo? Technically, yes, but it's better than if I would have continued to mess up the combo as a result of things being misaligned than to just wait for the Enseer window. So I follow the combo, and when I'm about to hit the third Enseer proc, I actually wait just a moment so that way I don't have any chance of missing it. Now, as I mentioned, the downside of this setup is that if you mess up the combo, if an enemy moves out of the way, if another enemy messes up the reactions, if you get staggered, which you can get staggered very, very easily, you can lose out on a lot of extra damage. But just due to the nature of Thundering Fury as a set and the stats that it gives, it's still one of the best sets, and it is really competitive with the others. Its initial damage floor is on the lower end of all the sets we're going to talk about, but its damage ceiling is the highest. Thundering Fury is also just a decent set overall, so it doesn't hurt to farm that for Cyno if you choose to use it. Cyno's stats can get a little complex when you're trying to max damage based on his teams. Generally speaking, he only needs about 110 to 120% energy recharge, and that's honestly just in case some RNG happens and you miss a skill. Most of the time, you'll want to default to an Elemental Mastery Sands, an Electro Damage Goblet, and a Crit Damage or Crit Rate Circlet. Technically, you can make 2 changes here, but it depends on the weapons and teams you're using. For example, if you're using an Elemental Mastery main stat weapon in a team without buffs, sometimes running an attack percent sands can be better. That said, I have a chart coming up in the weapon section that shows both EM sands and attack percent sands options for different weapons, so I recommend checking with the chart before committing to an attack percent sands, since most of the time EM is going to be better. Now, I'm hesitant to say this because I really don't want people to get the wrong idea, but I do want to let you guys know that this is an option that you have. For your circlet, on very rare occasion where you have a solid Elemental Mastery circlet, something like 30 crit value or more, it can be competitive with a crit circlet. If you're in a Hyperbloom or Overload based team that's still getting other reactions with Cyno's signature weapon, and you have high crit stats on an Elemental Mastery circlet, feel free to experiment with it to see how the team damage feels. To truly know if this is better for your account, you are literally going to have to use a calculator or test the damage yourself. It is on such a case-by-case basis that I can't really tell you. I just wanted to add this to the video because I like to cover all my bases. The one thing that you have to be aware of is if you do decide to make this change, you absolutely have to have a good crit ratio. If you lose your crit consistency or your ratio becomes low, it is not going to be worth it. This is only for lots of reactions, high-end end game Cyno gameplay. For most players and situations, you are going to want to stick to a crit circlet. It's easier than trying to find the breakpoint for your specific build and team. So once again, I recommend Elemental Mastery, Electro Damage, and Crit in that order. Elemental Mastery Sands, Electro Damage Goblet, and a Crit Damage or Crit Rate Circlet. At the end of the weapon section, I'll have 2 example builds for you guys, so if that was really confusing, don't worry about it. You'll see kind of what it should look like. As for substats, they're nice and easy. Energy recharge is good, but you don't really need a lot of it. If you're playing Thundering Fury and getting more skills per burst, you only really need about 120% tops. But if you're not playing Thundering Fury and you don't have any Electros in your team, going for somewhere between 150 and 160 is okay. Generally speaking, because he generates so much energy for himself, you don't really need that much ER, but you should make sure you're at least at that threshold if you don't have another Electro and if you're not using Thundering Fury. Outside of that, just go for crit rate and damage, Elemental Mastery, and attack. If all that was confusing, at the end of the weapon section, I'll have some example builds for you. Cyno has quite a few weapon options, so I'm going to briefly go over which ones are good and show you some stats afterwards to clear up any misunderstandings. First off, his signature, Staff of Scarlet Sands, is going to be best in slot. It's catered perfectly to his kit by granting him attack based on his elemental mastery. It also just has an insanely high crit rate, and it's a very solid weapon overall. After that, both Jade Spear and Staff of Homa deal pretty similar damage, and it's pretty high. This is mostly just due to Jade Spear's crit main stat and attack gain passive, while Staff of Homa is a huge stat stick. Deathmatch at high refinements is pretty good, and following that up is the White Tassel. Now, if you don't know White Tassel, it's actually a 3-star crit polearm, and it's used as a solid free-to-play option on characters like Xiao and Hu Tao. White Tassel can even be better than Calamity Queller when you run a few buffs in your team and an Elemental Mastery Sands, because it's a crit main stat weapon that increases normal attack damage, meaning that for someone like Cyno who mostly uses normal attacks and skills, he's getting a damage bonus a lot of the time. I'd highly recommend that if you're a free-to-play player without Staff of Homa, Jade Spear, or his signature, you should level White Tassel. Your other options, should you choose to use them, are any other 5-star polearms in the game, the Inazuma craftable Katane Cross, which has an Elemental Mastery main stat, Missive Wind Spear, the new free-to-play event polearm, and Moon Piercer. Now, on screen right now are 2 charts showing Cyno's damage per rotation with different weapons and artifacts. First up is the Elemental Mastery Sands chart. You'll notice that Thundering Fury doesn't get shown here. As we talked about earlier, 4th Thundering Fury is still technically the best option for most situations if you can pull it off perfectly, but it loses out quite a bit if you mess up the rotation or if enemies move, whatever the situation may be. So for this purpose, this chart is using follow-up best sets. The next image is with Cyno on Attack Sands. Some weapons perform better with an Attack Sands, and since you can use one while you farm for a good EM Sands, it's good to know which weapons perform better or worse. These charts were taken from the Cyno weapon sheets by Granian and Aurum, and the link to the full thing is in the description. All in all, if you don't have his signature, Jade Spear, Staff of Homa, or R5 Deathmatch, White Tassel is going to be your best bet. I know I gave you a lot of information, so I wanted to make 2 quick example builds so that way you can quickly process what your Cyno should look like. Not all builds will look like this, but these are just 2 ones that'll work. The first build is a 4-piece Thunder Soother set meant for aggravate teams, and it has an Elemental Mastery Sands, an Electro Damage Goblet, and a crit damage circlet. The reason we go crit damage here is because White Tassel already gives us a bit of crit rate, and since our only reaction is aggravate, we're getting slightly better damage with this build than with something like an EM circlet, unless it just had insane substats. The second build is for Hyper Bloom or Overload based teams, so we changed things up a bit. We're using Cyno's signature weapon that gives us bonus attack based on our Elemental Mastery. Since we're also getting some aggravates in here, we're seeing tons of reactions. Using the 4-piece Gilded Dream set will give us some attack and Elemental Mastery, and due to us using his weapon, we actually get even more value out of it. We get triple the value, buffing Cyno's personal damage, buffing Cyno's attack through his weapon, and reaction damage on top of that. If you have a really strong Elemental Mastery circlet, you can use it here, but for most people, you probably just want to stick with crit because it's the easiest thing. Once you've built your Cyno, it's time to put him in a team and conquer. So real quick, I want to talk about some Cyno teams. I actually am going to have a video coming out that's going to talk about these more in detail, give you rotations and everything, but I just wanted to showcase some teams that you could decide to run with Cyno that work okay. If you want to maximize Cyno's damage output, you're limited to just a few teams, but if you want to play some different playstyles, I'll have some teams like that available as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is an Aggravate team. The idea behind Aggravate is to just increase your Electro damage via Quicken, which is a reaction between Dendro and Electro. And to do that, you're going to be running someone like Cyno, Dendro MC, Fischl, and a Flex Spot. Now for the Flex Spot, I choose to run Zhongli because you don't have a healer in this team, and until we get a Dendro healer, you have to be very careful. So Zhongli's going to lower enemy resistances all around, help increase your Cyno's damage output, technically your Fischl's damage output, and everything else. And it's also going to give you a shield, which is pretty dang helpful. But you could also opt to run someone like Kazuha if you're just trying to get one floor of content done. Like let's say there was a Spiral Abyss challenge that was literally only one floor. You could get away with just using someone like Kazuha to buff your entire team's damage output and lower enemy resistances without needing the shield. In this case, it's actually really important to have Fischl. Fischl's going to increase the damage of this team by a lot because every time you activate an Electro reaction, Fischl's Oz is going to strike from off-field and deal bonus Electro damage, which should also proc Aggravate if the enemy is quickened. This team overall is actually very strong. It's going to definitely be one of Cyno's highest damage output teams, and it's pretty straightforward to get used to. The second team I want to showcase to you guys is a Hyper Bloom team. Now, essentially a Hyper Bloom team is an aggravate team with Hydro. You're going to be spawning Dendro cores with a fast applying Hydro unit. I like to use Xingqiu in this case, but you can use someone like Yelan or Kokomi. In the third slot, you have a Dendro MC. I recommend Dendro MC over Kale for Hyper Bloom because you get more Dendro application this way. And then you have your fourth slot, and your fourth slot is a flex spot between a Hydro or Electro character. Now, if you want Cyno to be getting all of the Hyper Blooms, you would need this flex spot to be another Hydro character, so you could run Xingqiu and Yelan together, and that would be really high single target damage and high Hydro application. However, you can also opt for more area damage and use someone like Beidou instead. The benefit of Beidou is that Cyno's going to be getting most of the Hyper Blooms still, and Beidou's burst is going to add up and deal a significant chunk of damage. Now, the reason you can use Beidou in this team is because Cyno actually generates a ton of Electro energy when he's in his burst, and that actually works in place of Fischl in the Beidou team. Now, another option you have is to run Kuki here, and that can actually be okay. It gives you a dedicated healer and also means that you'll be able to trigger Hyper Blooms that deal even more damage than Cyno's Hyper Blooms. However, I just personally feel like that takes away the point of the Hyper Bloom team because you want Cyno to be triggering most of them anyways, but the option is there. Now, the third team I want to show you guys is a Taser team, and I know that sounds really, really basic and not innovative at all, but one of the biggest problems that Cyno has is, like I said, he's not very flexible, and when a character isn't super flexible, you just kind of slot them into the meta team, and they end up being okay because all the other units are really busted. So like I said in the last team, Cyno can actually act as a battery for Beidou in a way. Beidou won't be catching the particles, but you'll be generating so many electro particles with Cyno that Beidou will actually be fine. So you can use Beidou, Xingqiu, and then a fourth spot flex like an Anemo unit. I like to use Kazuha here, but you could also use someone like Sucrose instead. It should also be noted that you can also opt for double Hydro Taser. And then, like I said with the last team, you can kind of just slot a character into a meta team and it'll do okay because the other characters in it are very good. This is the Psy National team, which is going to be Cyno, Xingqiu, Bennett, and Xiangling. This is essentially Raiden National, except you don't have a universal battery unless your Cyno's at C4. And in it, he'll add quite a bit of overload damage, but he'll also have high personal damage in conjunction with your Xingqiu and your Xiangling. The fifth team is a little bit gimmicky. I actually really like it though. It's Cyno, Thoma, a Dendro character, and Kuki. Now, the interesting thing about this team is that two of your characters are built full EM. Both your Thoma and your Kuki are going to be full EM characters. Kuki's going to allow you to heal, and Thoma's going to give you decent shielding even with his full EM build because it's based off his HP. Both Thoma and Kuki should be trading off overloads, and you should be dealing really solid overload damage. Cyno can also trigger some overloads, and ideally with burning and with overload and with quicken and aggravate as well, you should be able to deal a pretty decent amount of damage. Now, this team isn't an amazing, like super broken team, but I will say this is one of the more cozy teams I've tried. It has a healer, it has a shielder, and it doesn't feel like Cyno's gonna die all the time. So I think that's a huge step up. I'll talk about these teams more in detail in my Cyno teams guide, but I hope these teams gave you some ideas for things to play. Right now, we're sort of just in Dendro healer waiting room, but I'm also fairly certain that Cyno's gonna have a lot more synergies going forward. Now, one thing I didn't cover earlier in the video is Cyno constellations, because the majority of people will just be going for him at C0. If you're interested in knowing about his constellation value though, I'll go over that right now. First off, Cyno C1 is an attack speed increase in his burst that lasts for 10 seconds and can be refreshed when you activate Cyno's first passive bonus. This constellation is pretty dang straightforward in concept. It's basically going to allow you to refresh internal cooldown slightly faster and partially change your combos. If you use this constellation, the combo I went over at the beginning of the video likely won't work. I'm gonna work on some constellation testing soon, and when I get the combo down for Thundering Fury, it will be a pinned comment. Now, his C2 is another damage increase, and it's more significant. Every normal attack he lands will give him a 10% electro damage bonus for 4 seconds, up to a max of 5 stacks. Basically, you'll have a consistent 50% electro damage bonus in his burst. It adds a fair bit of damage to your rotation overall. Cyno's Constellation 3 will increase his burst level by 3, which is a pretty decent damage increase. C4, it looks really confusing, but it's pretty straightforward as well. Essentially, it just makes it so that when Cyno triggers a reaction, he gives your party minus himself energy to their bank. It's 3 energy per proc, up to a max of 5 procs for 15 energy. If you're min-maxing, this constellation can effectively raise team damage by making your energy requirements per character lower. It's actually pretty insane in concept. I just wouldn't roll 5 copies of a 5-star for it, personally. His C5 increases his skill level by 3, which is an okay damage buff. And his Constellation 6 reads like a Yu-Gi-Oh card like a lot of his kit, but it's pretty simple. Every time you trigger his first Ascension passive that gives you that damage bonus, you'll gain 4 stacks of Day of the Jackal. Now, Day of the Jackal, every single time a stack is consumed, you're going to fire off a Duststalker bolt. The Duststalker bolts are basically the things that they send off in his first Ascension passive that deal a little bit of bonus damage. So essentially, the C6 is just going to be adding a fair bit of damage to your Cyno's combo. The one downside is I actually haven't been able to test this to see how ICD lines up with these extra bolts, but overall, it's still going to be a pretty significant damage gain. All in all, Cyno's constellations all add a little bit. As you can see right here on this chart, this is an estimate of about how much each constellation is adding. If you are going to go in for Cyno constellations and you're not going to C6, I recommend stopping at C2. But again, just a disclaimer, I don't ever recommend pulling for character constellations unless you literally have no will to get any other characters in the game, or unless you just want to spend a lot of money on the game. That's your prerogative. So what's the final verdict on Cyno? Let's talk about that. Cyno is definitely one of the more interesting character releases we've had because he's not necessarily a bad character, but there's definitely a lot of negativity circulating around him. In my experience playing Cyno, I've found that he is definitely a very fun unit to play. I think it's cool experimenting with a bunch of different combos. I think playing Thundering Fury with him and trying to learn how to optimize while also just getting bonus slams is really fun. And all in all, his damage is fairly decent. But if you're considering pulling Cyno for meta reasons, then I would potentially reconsider. Cyno is not a bad unit by any means. He's actually fine. But when you look at teams from a meta-specific perspective, you're looking at top teams and you're looking at how a character can fit into top teams to make them better in one way or another, or introduce a completely new team into the fold. And unfortunately, Cyno has not introduced any brand new teams or done a good job of replacing another character in any top teams. If you're looking to use an Electro character in meta teams, you have a few options, right? You could use Raiden in Raiden National, and if you put Cyno in that team, it becomes a worse team. You could go play Hyperbloom teams, but imagine how many other Electro units could fill the same niche as Cyno. You could go play him in Taser, but there's 1,000 other Taser variants, and many of them deal more damage than the Cyno variant. Cyno's long burst timing makes him a little bit of an awkward unit because you can't fully utilize buffs throughout your entire rotation, especially if you want to get your own burst back. And it makes me believe that he's actually meant for a character that's going to come later down the line, maybe a supporting Dendro unit that will have a bigger radius, or will have faster application, or just longer application. That said, you should never pull for a unit because they might be good in the future, because characters get reruns in this game. Unless the character is going straight to the standard banner, that character will be coming back at some point, and it'll likely be before the end of the region. So with that said, for meta reasons, I don't necessarily think Cyno is a character that you need to pick up. However, don't get it mixed up, he is still a really solid unit, and he's a lot of fun to play. He's a very enjoyable character. When I was doing my Abyss runs, I had a lot of fun experimenting with different teams and reactions. He was one of the first Overload teams I got to play that I found to be somewhat effective, aside from Raiden National, that was also extremely engaging. If you enjoy characters that will keep your attention on the game, that will make you press lots of buttons, and if you're honestly just ADHD like me, you will probably enjoy Cyno's gameplay loop. All in all, Cyno's a pretty solid unit. You definitely don't need to pull for him if you're worried about meta things, because he's not going to power creep anybody, at least not right now with the units currently in the game. But if you do really enjoy engaging characters, Cyno is a pretty fun one, and he might be a good pickup for you. Thanks for watching, everyone. As always, make sure to like the video down below and consider coming over to my live stream at twitch.tv/Braxophone. What do you think about Cyno? Go ahead and leave a comment down below, and keep an eye out for my Cyno teams guide. It's coming out very, very soon. I'll catch you guys next time.